The length of a shadow of a building is 32 meters. The distance from the top of the building to the tip of the shadow is 37 meters. Find the height of the building. So again, we're using the Pythagorean theorem since we're dealing with a right triangle. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. And remember, locate your hypotenuse, and that's opposite the right angle. So our longest side, our c, our hypotenuse is 37. So we're looking for the height of the building, and we know the other leg is 32 meters. So we have a squared plus 32 squared equals our hypotenuse, which is 37 squared. So we need to find out what 32 squared is, which is 1024. We need to find out what 37 squared is, and that's 1369. So now, just like we did before, we're going to isolate. So we're going to subtract 1024 from both sides so that we can isolate our variable. So a squared would equal 345. And now we take the square root of both sides. And now in our instructions it says round to the nearest tenth. So in your calculator, you're going to put in the square root of 345, which equals 18.57417. And we're rounding to the nearest tenth. So we look to the right, and the value to the right is greater than 4, so we round up. So A would equal approximately 18.6 meters. So now we have a 12-foot ladder leaning up against the side of a house. The bottom of the ladder is 7 feet from the side of the house. How high is the top of the ladder from the ground? And again, we're going to round to the tenths place. So again, we're going to use our Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equaling c squared. We're going to identify our hypotenuse, which is opposite our right angle. So our hypotenuse is 12. And we're looking again for the height. So we're going to say a squared plus 7 squared equals 12 squared. So now we're going to square each one. So a squared plus 49 equals 12 squared, which are 144. We're going to subtract 49 from both sides so that we can isolate our variable. Next, we take the square root. So a would equal the square root of 95. So on your calculator, you're going to find the square root of 95, which is 9.74679. And we're rounding to the nearest tenths. So when I look to the right, that value is not greater than 4. So we just drop everything and we do not round up. So it just remains approximately 9.7 feet. And again, keep in mind that our hypotenuse is our longest side, which is 12, and this is below 12. So our answer is valid. So our next problem deals with solving using the square root property. So in these previous problems, we did use the square root property, but we only used the principal square root or the positive value. Why? Because we were dealing with height and measurement. Remember, when we're dealing with measurement, it cannot be negative. So in these problems, we're going to go through the same type process. We're going to isolate our variable. So here it's already isolated. It says solve y squared equals 16, where y is a real number. So in order to isolate, we would move everything on to the other side except for y, and that's the case already. So next we're going to take the square root. Now when we take the square root, it's going to be the positive or negative square root. The degree, which is 2, tells us how many solutions we can have. So when I take the square root of y squared, I get y, and the square root of 16 is 4. So notice I have the positive and negative in front, so I do have two solutions, positive 4 and negative 4. I can have a negative solution. We're not talking about the measurement or height, etc. of something. We're just asked to solve for a variable. Next, solve x squared equals 13, where x is a real number. So again, we have x squared equaling 13. We're going to use the square root property, keeping in mind how many solutions. So we're going to have the positive or negative square root of 13. So on the left hand side, the square root of x squared is x, and on the right hand side there are no perfect square factors of 13, so our two answers would be positive square root of 13 and the opposite or negative square root of 13 for our two solutions. Next, solve the quantity w minus 8 squared minus 80 equals 0. So the first thing we want to do is isolate. So I'm going to move the 80 on the other side by adding its opposite. So on the left hand side I have the quantity w minus 8 squared, and on the right hand side I have positive 80. Now we're going to use the square root property. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides, keeping in mind I have two solutions, the positive and the negative. On the left hand side I have w minus 8. And on the right hand side I have positive or negative square root of 80. Now 80 does have a perfect square factor, so we need to simplify that further. So 80 can be rewritten as the square root of 16, which is a perfect square, times the square root of 5. And simplifying that further, we know that the square root of 16 is 4, so that gives us positive or negative 4 square roots of 5. Now remember, we're solving for w, so we're going to add 8 to both sides. So this gives us w equals 8 plus or minus 4 square roots of 5. We cannot add those together because they're not like terms. So we do have two solutions. One is 8 plus 4 square roots of 5, and the other one is 8 minus 4 square roots of 5. Our next problem is solving a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus. Why is it plus or minus? Because remember, we have two solutions. The square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now where does the a and b and c come from? Well, the standard form of a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the a is the coefficient. Now it's just a number, it doesn't include the x. The coefficient of our x squared. The b is the coefficient of our middle term, x. And the c is our constant. So the first thing you want to do is identify, based on what we're given, make sure first you set it to 0. A is going to be 9. B is positive 3. And C is negative 1. So now we're going to place those values into the formula. So we're solving for x. So x equals the opposite of b. So since b is positive 3, the opposite is negative 3. Plus or minus, because we have those two solutions, the square root of b squared. So b is 3. 3 times 3 is 9. Minus 4 times a, which is 9, times c, which is negative 1. And that's all over 2a, or in this case, 2 times 9. So let's go to simplify. We have negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9. Now, to simplify, I'm multiplying negative 4 times 9 times negative 1. So negative 4 times 9 is negative 36. Times negative 1 gives me positive 36. And that's all over 18. So combining like terms, I have negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 45 over 18. Now, we need to simplify the square root of 45. So the highest perfect square factor of 45 is 9. So I rewrite that as the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. And the square root of 9 is 3. So that gives me 3 square roots of 5. So now I have negative 3 plus or minus 3 square roots of 5 over 18. Now our last step is to simplify if possible. We're looking to see if a number divides into negative 3, 3, and 18. It has to divide evenly into all three. And 3 does. So I divide a 3 out of each one of these to get my final answer. So my final answer is negative 1 plus or minus 1 square root of 5, which we can just write it as the square root of 5, all over 6. The 1 in front of the radical sign is not necessary. Our next problem, it says use the quadratic formula to solve, but this one's different as far as how they want us to write our answer. It says round your answer to the nearest hundredth. So that means we're going to put this in our calculator. So we're going to set up the problem exactly the same as we did in the last example. We're going to find A, B, and C first. So remember, A is the coefficient of our x squared term. B is the coefficient of our middle term. And C would be our constant, which is negative 1. So now we're going to put it into the formula. So x equals the opposite of b. Since b is 9, this is negative 9, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So 9 times 9 is 81 minus 4 times A, which is 4, times C, which is negative 1, all over 2A, which in this case is 2 times 4. Okay, so let's go ahead and simplify. So we'd have negative 9 plus or minus the square root of 81. And remember, we're going to take negative 4 times negative 1. So negative 4 times 4 is negative 16 times negative 1 is positive 16. And that's all over 2 times 4, or 8. Combining like terms, I have negative 9 plus or minus the square root of 97 over 8. So now we need to put this in our calculator to find our two answers. So remember, we have two answers. We have negative 9 plus the square root of 97 over 8 that you're going to put in your calculator, and then negative 9 minus the square root of 97 over 8. So go ahead and put those in your calculator, and you should end up with 0.10610 for the first one, and negative 2.35610 for the second one. Now we're rounding to the nearest hundredths place. So we look to the right, and this value is greater than 4. So we're going to round up. So our first answer is 0.11. And for the second one, again, we're rounding to the nearest hundredths place. So we look at the value to the right. Since it's greater than 4, we round up, which would give us negative 2.36. Now our next problem, it says find all the complex solutions. So remember, when we were talking about complex numbers, we know that I equals the square root of negative 1. So a negative underneath the radical sign is acceptable because we're talking about complex numbers. Under the set of real numbers, there'd be no solution if there was a negative. So the process is the same. We're going to identify A, which is the value in front of our x squared, the coefficient, which is 7. B, in this case, negative 2. And C, positive 3. Plugging it into our quadratic formula, the opposite of B would be positive 2 plus or minus the square root of B squared, so negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4, minus 4 times A, which is 7, times C, which is 3, all over 2 times A, or 2 times 7 in this case. So we would have 2 plus or minus the square root of 4. Now remember, I'm multiplying negative 4 times 7 times 3. So negative 4 times 7 is negative 28. And then when you multiply negative 28 times 3, you get negative 84. And that's all over 14. Okay, so next we're going to combine like terms. and then simplify. So when we're simplifying the square root of negative 80, we're going to take out the square root of negative 1, and then we're going to break down 80 into its highest perfect square factor, which is 16 times 5. So the square root of negative 1 and 16 would give us 4i, because the square root of 16 is 4, and remember the square root of negative 1 is I, square roots of 5. So we have 2 plus or minus 4i times the square root of 5 over 14. Now our last step is to simplify. So we look for a value that divides evenly into 14, 2, and 4i. And since they're all even numbers, 2 divides evenly into all of them. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. 4i divided by 2 is 2i. And 14 divided by 2 is 7. So our final answer, this 1 is necessary, so it's 1 plus or minus 2i square roots of 5 over 7. And our next problem, we're going to deal with another word problem. And it says a model rocket is launched with an initial upward velocity of 201 feet per second. The rocket's height h, so remember h represents height in feet, after t seconds is given by the following: h equals 201t minus 16t squared. Find all the values of t, so we're looking for the time for which the rocket's height, which is h, is 93 feet. So we're going to substitute 93 in for h. So nothing else changes right now. Okay, so remember, this is a quadratic since we have something raised to the second power. So we need to set this to 0. So I'm going to move the negative 16t squared on the other side by taking its opposite. I'm going to move the 201t on the other side by taking its opposite. And the 93 stays, so its sign does not change. So our new quadratic equation would be 16t squared minus 201t plus 93 equals 0. So we're going to use our quadratic formula to help us solve for t. So again, we need to identify a, b, and c. So a is 16, b is negative 201, and c is positive 93. So we're going to put this in our quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of b. So since b is 201, the opposite is positive 201, plus or minus. Now on your calculator, you're going to have to take 201 and square it, which is 40,401 minus 4 times a, which is 16, times c, which is 93, all over 2 times a, which in this case would be 2 times 16. So let's go ahead and continue to simplify. So next, we need to multiply the negative 4 times the 16 times the 93. And that gives us negative 5,952. and that's all over 2 times 16, which is 32. So continue to simplify. We would take 40,401 and subtract the 5952 from that. So underneath our radical sign, we have 34,449, and that's all over 32. So we need to plug this into our calculator. Remember, we have the two answers. We have 201 plus the square root of 34,449 over 32. And we also have 201 minus the square root of 34,449 over 32. So put those values in the calculator and you should end up with 12.0813 for the first, and for the second 0.48111. Now keep in mind, pay attention to what they say to round to. So in this case, we're rounding to the nearest hundredth. So for the nearest hundredth, we look to the place to the right. Since it's not greater than 4, it takes 12.08, or again, we're going to look at the hundredths place, and the value to the right is not greater than 4, so it stays 0.48. So it either takes 12.08 seconds or 0.48 seconds to reach a height of 93 feet.